Hi there, I'm Jim Zirin. Welcome back for more conversations. Our show is about the awesome power of the President of the United States, and particularly how that power is administered through the President's Chief of Staff. Before Richard Nixon became president in 1969, presidents largely used friends and family as close advisors. Wilson had Colonel House, Roosevelt had Harry Hopkins, Eisenhower, used to a military model, appointed New Hampshire Governor Sherman Adams to make sure the right people had access and his orders were carried out. Adams was the very model of a strong chief of staff until he resigned for accepting gifts from a favor seeker. With us is author, documentary filmmaker, and TV producer Chris Whipple. Chris has written a fascinating new book entitled The Gatekeepers: How the White House Chiefs of Staffs Define Every Presidency. Many books lose their relevancy as time goes on. This book seems to become more relevant every day of the Trump administration, with John Kelly replacing Reince Priebus to become Trump's second chief of staff. In the book, Chris Whipple draws some startling conclusions. Chris, welcome.
Thanks for having me.
So please tell us something about the background of the book. You're by trade a documentary filmmaker, last I looked.
Yeah, I'm a filmmaker. That's my day job. But this began with a phone call out of the blue from a stranger, Jules Naudet, who with his brother Gideon Naudet had done the iconic documentary 9/11. They wanted to know if I would partner with them on a documentary about the White House Chiefs of Staff, which we did for the Discovery Channel in 2013. It was 4 hours, and yet I thought that it just barely scratched the surface of this unbelievable, untold story about 17 living White House Chiefs of Staff who really make the difference between success and disaster for every president.
So how long did it take you to write the book?
Well, we began filming for the documentary in 2011. It aired in 2013. I finished this book last December, wrote a hasty epilogue after Donald Trump's election. But I did have other projects in between, but off and on for 4 years.
4 years. Yep. Now, did you interview all 17 living chiefs of staff?
I did. And it's a fabulous cast of characters. You know, it's a cast of characters that Aaron Sorkin couldn't have dreamed up. You know, when you think about Don Rumsfeld, Dick Cheney, his deputy, who back in the 70s was the most popular guy in Washington, all the way up to Rahm Emanuel, who, of course, served no drama Obama. That was an odd couple, if ever there was one. So it's an extraordinary cast of characters, and of course, all of it going back to the person who really created the template for the modern White House chief, H.R. Bob Haldeman, who was Richard Nixon's infamous White House chief.
He went to jail.
He went to jail.
And got Nixon into some trouble because he authorized the White House taping system.
Absolutely. And
voice activated.
Yeah, exactly. Voice activated, by the way, and one of the stories I tell in the book is that the reason that Haldeman decided to have the White House taping system voice activated was because they tried everything with Nixon with manual tape recorders, and he was so hopelessly clumsy that he couldn't turn the tape recorder on and off. But in any event, the great irony of Haldeman is that he went to jail for the greatest political scandal in American history, and yet he is the guy who really created the template for the modern White House chief, a template that presidents have strayed from at their peril ever since.
Now, you started your account with Nixon. Why didn't you go back to Eisenhower and Adams? Why wasn't he the template?
You can make a case for Sherman Adams. You mentioned him. He was a gruff, tough, monosyllabic character, a famous gatekeeper. He was called the abominable no man. But he was a gatekeeper, but Haldeman and Nixon really took the job to another level. Haldeman was obsessed with it. Haldeman created the modern empowered chief who was not only the gatekeeper who creates time and space for the president to think, but he was also the honest broker of information, the person who made sure that every decision is teed up with information on every side of a decision, and also making sure that only the most important decisions get into the Oval Office. He was the person in charge of the president's message, making sure that everybody was on the page every day. So in charge of communications and speech writing. He was, at the end of the day, the person who executed Richard Nixon's agenda. And everybody came through him. Famously, in a cabinet meeting, Richard Nixon told all of his cabinet secretaries that you will report to Haldeman. He is the Lord High Executioner. You are to do what he tells you. And so...
It's out of the Mikado. You have in the book that Eisenhower reportedly said to Nixon, you're going to need your own SOB.
Yeah.
Was Haldeman an SOB?
He was...
And what did he mean by that?
He was famously the so-called pluperfect son of a and that's what Nixon thought he needed, and he got it in the form of H.R. Haldeman. I think that, you know, there certainly have been a number of White House chiefs in history who were also SOBs. You don't have to be, and that was part of Haldeman's downfall, I think. It's hurt other White House chiefs as well. I think John Sununu under George H.W. Bush was something of an SOB. He was hard on the White House staff. That came back to bite him in the end. I think that James A. Baker III under Ronald Reagan, Leon Panetta under Bill Clinton, those were guys who proved that you don't have to be the president's son of a bitch.
Speak softly and carry a big stick.
Panetta was described to me as somebody who was an iron fist inside a velvet glove. Panetta was you can't just intimidate and scare. You have to be able to motivate and lead your troops.
Now, the subtitle of your book is How the White House Chiefs of Staff Define Every Presidency. How does the Chief of Staff, who was unelected and who was unconfirmed, how does the Chief of Staff define a presidency?
Well, at the end of the day, he is the person who, ever since Nixon, and it really, in my mind, began with the Nixon administration, has been true ever since. The White House chief, every president learns sometimes the hard way that you cannot govern effectively without empowering a White House chief of staff as first among equals in the White House to execute your agenda, as we've said, and most importantly, to tell the president what he does not want to hear. That's something that is absolutely critical. Every president needs it. And you know, the stunning thing to me from doing the book was to learn that, you know, in Hollywood they say nobody knows anything. In Washington it seems nobody learns anything. Presidents make the same mistake time after time after time. And Donald Trump is only the latest and most dramatic example of somebody who came into office so full of hubris, so convinced he was the smartest guy in the room, that he failed to empower a White House chief. And he paid the price. The first 9 months, nothing happened. Nothing got done.
Well, his first chief, Reince Priebus, lasted only 6 months, roughly.
Yeah.
Now, where did he fail, and where did he drop the ball? Well,
Reince Priebus, I've been pretty tough on Reince Priebus, and God knows he made plenty of rookie mistakes. You can start from day one with the ridiculous debate over the inauguration photos to the botched executive order on immigration. That's White House Chief of Staff malpractice.
Well, there were at least two of them, and maybe even a third. So.
Yeah, and so there were plenty of mistakes that Priebus made. The Trump White House for the first 9 months was broken. Couldn't do anything right. It couldn't pass legislation. It couldn't issue executive orders that were enforceable. It couldn't prioritize the president's agenda. It couldn't get anybody on the same page. You had
appointed Mike Flynn, even though Trump was warned by Obama that Flynn was bad news.
Yeah, so it was mistake after mistake. But to come back to my original point, that Donald Trump is not the first president to have made this mistake. In fairness to Priebus, the real problem was that Donald Trump failed to empower his White House chief to do all of the things we've been talking about. You can't govern effectively unless you empower a White House chief as first among equals. Priebus never had that authority, and that's been true of other presidents as well.
So who had the authority in the first 6 months of the Trump administration? Bannon? Scaramucci?
Well, the problem is that nobody did.
Gorka?
The problem was it was like, you know, the House of Borga with everybody, you know, whispering into the ear of the president and nobody empowered to figure out what the agenda was, much less execute it. So
feeding ground glass to their enemies.
That was the problem with the first 6 months. Now, it's not the first time this has happened. You know, time after time, presidents have come into office thinking that they can govern the way they campaigned. Jimmy Carter was warned by the outgoing White House Chief of Staff, Jerry Ford's White House Chief of Staff, Dick Cheney. He said, beware the so-called spokes of the wheel, where the president is at the center and everybody reports to him. It was a disaster for Jerry Ford. They fixed it. Carter and Hamjurden ignored Cheney's advice and everybody else's, and Carter thought he could run the White House himself. 2.5 years in, with his agenda paralyzed and the White House dysfunctional, he finally gave the authority and the title to Hamjurden, who, by the way, was the wrong choice, as it turned out. But presidents sometimes take a while to figure this out.
What kind of background is best for a chief of staff? We've had lawyers, we've had budget directors, we've had people who've been in the government for some time, we've people who've never been in the government.
No, there's no formula for a perfect chief of staff. There's no graduate school for it. Every effective chief obviously needs to be respected by the president. So it can be someone the president knows, but it probably shouldn't be someone who is too close a friend, who cannot tell the president no.
Like Andrew Card.
Perhaps. But I think that one of the things that is terribly important and often overlooked, and it was true of some of the best chiefs, Jim Baker under Reagan, Leon Panetta under Clinton, temperament is an important thing, and experience. These were guys who were comfortable in their own skin, who had been around the block, who knew Congress, knew Capitol Hill, but had nothing to prove. And they could walk into the Oval Office, close the door behind them, and say, Mr. President, you cannot go down this road for the following reasons. Here's what will happen. They could tell the president what he didn't want to hear. That's a critical responsibility for the White House chief.
So if Don Regan had been a stronger chief of staff for President Reagan, we might not have had Iran-Contra?
That's how consequential the appointment can be. There's no question in my mind that Iran-Contra never would have happened on Jim Baker's watch. What happened was that 4 years in, Baker was burned out, he was exhausted, he was desperate to get out of the job. He went to Don Regan, and Regan said, Jim, why don't we swap jobs? Well, this turned out to be the most disastrous job swap in American political history, and it was one of the few times, perhaps the only time, that Nancy Reagan's usually infallible antenna failed her. She signed off on this swap. Don Regan, who had been a former co-chairman of Merrill Lynch, not that there's anything wrong with that, but people who are principals, former CEOs, former governors, in Jim Baker's opinion, they tend to think that the most important word in the title is chief, not staff. The most important word is staff.
Now, Ken Duberstein, who then succeeded eventually Reagan as Reagan's chief of staff, he was there a short time, but he said, always remember that when you open your mouth, he came from Brooklyn, when you open your mouth, it is not you, but the president who's speaking.
He said it to Rahm Emanuel in an amazing gathering in the White House right before Rahm Emanuel became Barack Obama's White House chief. He said this to Rahm, and to which Rahm replied, "Oh, blank." But anyway, it's. You
think that's an exaggeration? Was the statement hyperbolic? Or?
No, I think it's true. I think it's true to this extent. Erskine Bowles, who was also a very successful, terrific manager, very effective White House chief under Bill Clinton, said that the moment anyone suspects that you're not speaking for the president, that you don't have his authority, that he doesn't have your back, The moment that happens, people can sense it, they can smell it, they know it, and you've lost your authority, you're powerless, and all you've become at that point is an overblown scheduler.
Now we have John Kelly, appointed July 28th, 2017, former Marine Corps general. What's your perception of how Kelly is doing?
Importantly, he has the respect of Donald Trump. That seems to be clear. He commands the room. Somebody told me that John Kelly is the son Fred Trump wishes he'd had. He's Gary Cooper. He clearly has the respect of Donald Trump, and that's very important. I think Kelly made a big mistake in the beginning. He declared that he would be in charge of managing the West Wing, but he would not attempt to manage the president. Now, maybe that declaration was for an audience of one, but if
we have Kelly, we still have early morning tweets, many of which are terribly unfortunate.
He's failed to discipline Donald Trump. Now, maybe that's mission impossible, but you cannot, if you're White House Chief of Staff, assume that making the trains run on time in the West Wing is the full job description. That's the easy part. The hard part is walking into the Oval Office and telling the president what he doesn't want to hear. And the unhinged Twitter storms that continue, the Charlottesville Declaration, the taunting of Kim Jong-un, all of that is the kind of thing that an empowered White House Chief of Staff should be preventing.
Do you think Kelly has succeeded to any degree in reining in Donald Trump?
I think he succeeded in making the West Wing a more orderly, disciplined operation, and he's the door to the Oval Office, it tends to be closed rather than open. It used to be like at Grand Central Station with people coming and going.
That's desirable in your view?
That's absolutely desirable and necessary, and it's resulted in a tighter ship. Kelly also, managed to heave some of those loose cannons over the side, like Anthony Scaramucci and some others.
Steve Bannon and Gorka.
Gorka,
all
Bannon
history.
is gone. So, Kelly he's running a tighter ship, but the trouble is that he still needs to be able to rein in the captain from time to time, especially when he goes off the rails.
Is it too tight a ship? I mean, he fired Keith Schiller, who was a long-term confidant of Donald Trump, because Schiller showed Trump a news article that hadn't been cleared with Kelly.
Like, I don't think you can possibly have too tight a ship, when it comes to Donald Trump. You've got to have that. I think that on the other hand, that's sometimes somewhat overblown. I mean, Kelly has not really shut down all of Trump's sources of information. Trump still has a phone that he uses that Kelly doesn't monitor. He calls Bannon, he calls Schiller, he calls Priebus, he calls a lot of his old friends. The notion that Donald Trump is trapped in the Oval Office with just one flow of information is not accurate, I don't think.
Well, but what about statements undermining our judicial system? I guess under Kelly, he said our judicial system is a disgrace, it's a joke, stinks.
That's the kind of thing that Kelly, if you're an empowered White House Chief of Staff, if you know what you're doing, it's still the president's presidency. He still makes the decisions. And you don't substitute your own judgment for the president's. But if, as Josh Bolton told me, George W. Bush's second chief, it's your job, if the president is behaving in ways that undermine his agenda, it's your job as White House Chief of Staff to point that out.
Well, let's take the president's recent trip to Mississippi to dedicate a civil rights museum. And he made the statement, I think informally, but it was taped and it was on television, where he said many of the institutions in America are sick. Most of us don't believe that many of the institutions are sick. and possibly if there's sickness, it's in the executive branch and in the Oval Office.
No, I mean it's unprecedented. It's beyond the pale. I think most of us would feel, people who believe in the democratic institutions. Beyond that, it points to something else, and that is, let's assume for the moment that Donald Trump has learned the first lesson of his first 9 months in office, which is that you have to empower a White House chief, as he's done to some extent with John Kelly. It's clear that Donald Trump has not learned the second major lesson, which is that governing is nothing like campaigning. When you campaign, you try to destroy your opponent. You demonize your opponent.
Lock her up.
You demonize, you divide. That's campaigning. Governing is a very different thing. When you try to govern, you have to expand beyond your base. You have to build coalitions. Ken Duberstein said, when you're campaigning, you're obliterating your opponent. When you're governing, you have to make love to your opponent. Ronald Reagan and Tip O'Neill could get together over whiskey and get stuff done. Trump doesn't understand that. We're a year in. There's no indication that he's ever going to get that. He knows what he knows. He knows what worked to make him president. But he's got to, if he wants to get anything done, if he wants to be a transformational president or even be reelected, he's got to learn how to govern. There's no indication that he has, and Kelly hasn't shown him how.
Well, do you think Kelly has the requisite political instincts?
I fear he may not, and one of the reasons for that is take a look at the way he handled the Gold Star widow flap when he took the stage in the White House briefing room, and he began with this eloquent description of how the bodies of fallen soldiers are prepared for burial. And then he segued into this.
He lost his own son in battle.
That's right. And if he'd stopped right there, it would have been a powerful appearance and message. But then he went off on this unhinged attack, which turned out to be false, on Representative Wilson, an elected representative. And it just proved that Kelly is out of his depth politically. This is somebody who clearly, try to imagine Jim Baker or Leon Panetta doing that. It points to the fact that Kelly is new at this, and certainly politically.
Well, we talked about background of chiefs of staff, and here's a military man who is used to saluting and saying yes, sir, whenever he's ordered to do something. Is that undesirable in a chief of staff? You indicate it should be someone who can stand up to the president. And say, but sir.
Yeah, and you would think that a general like Kelly could do that, and yet, as you say, maybe there's something else at work here. But there's not much precedent for this. I mean, the only other general we've had as a White House chief of staff was Alexander Haig, who was a holdover.
Said, I'm in charge here, even though the Constitution said he wasn't in charge.
Who later, when he was Secretary of State under Reagan, had that infamous performance. And so, Haig performed but Haig was ineffective under Jerry Ford. It was a disaster, in part because Ford was trying to govern with, according to the spokes of the wheel model. So it wasn't entirely Haig's fault. But one service Haig really did perform for the American people was, and it might be a page that John Kelly needs to take, is that in the depths of Watergate, when Richard Nixon was drinking heavily and wandering the West Wing talking to the oil portraits, Al Haig and James Schlesinger took the precaution of making sure that the nuclear codes were safe, or at least that Schlesinger would be informed if there was any funny business going on with them. Funny is the wrong word, clearly. that was a service that Haig performed at that moment of crisis. I think that John Kelly, given the president he serves and his tendency to be completely, to go off on these unhinged tirades, there's a real question about whether Kelly needs to have a conversation, perhaps with the other generals, with Mattis and with H.R. McMaster, very much like the one that Schlesinger and Haig had.
Very much so. So I have a question for you, Chris Whipple. And the question is, does the White House Chief of Staff make for a successful or an unsuccessful president?
The answer is he does. The answer is yes, that you cannot govern effectively without an empowered White House Chief of Staff who can execute your agenda and tell you what you don't want to hear.
Tell you what you don't want to hear. Chris Whipple, thank you so much for coming by.
My pleasure.
Terrific book, The Gatekeepers. All the best to you. I hope you're writing another book about Trump and Kelly. And thank you for coming by. Tune in next week for more conversations. I'm Jim Zirin. Take care and all the best.